So Dr. Lynn, if you wouldn't mind also just giving us a brief introduction, how you first engaged with science fiction, what it means to you professionally and personally.
Yeah, great. So thank you so much for having us. I'm very excited to be a part of this discussion. So for me, my main interest in science fiction was mostly about space. So it's sort of weird that I went from the extreme of being interested in space and travel and planets, exoplanets, and now instead I'm just looking inside people's brains. I think it's the in many ways it's fun to think about the parallels between the vast emptiness of space and the complexity of the brain as being having a lot in common, but sort of the scale is pretty different. So it's kind of weird that I ended up in neurobiology, considering all of my interests in science fiction. Mostly it's related to stuff like Star Wars and stuff like Dune and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That's sort of my origin into science fiction. And then most recently, got interested in transhumanism type questions when we're thinking about stuff like androids and ways to improve humans in certain ways. And that ties in a lot with my professional interests. So my research, as you had said, my research is mostly in neurodegenerative disorders, particularly Parkinson's disease. And of that, there's a strong evidence suggesting that you can permanently implant these stimulators into people's brains and it improves their symptoms dramatically. So I think that's sort of where the two worlds sort of meet.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just gonna note personally that at least in field from my experience, that's not unusual to kind of be excited about space and the fictional world of space, and then sort of move to seeing the brain as the final frontier, given how much we still have to learn about it. But with those introductions, we're going to dive right into the conversation, and this is going to be pretty freeform. So I think we're going to have our presenters here. And again, anybody is welcome to join in with questions via hand raise on Zoom or by walking up to the front in the physical room. But the first idea that we wanted to talk about was if you could, sorry, my screen has been acting up. But if you could just talk a little bit about how you understand the relationship between science and science fiction, just in the broadest sense. What do you each think that looks like now, and what would it look like ideally in the best productive relationship between these two areas?
Okay, I guess I'll start off. So I think that science fiction comes in many different flavors and forms, some of which should be taken very differently than others. For the same reason that fantasy is distinct from science fiction. In science fiction, first of all, we typically think that the objects of the story are possible, which is something that science fiction aficionados often insist upon in distinguishing between science fiction and fantasy. So that's why the authors I mentioned in my introduction statements are really considered to be sort of at the canon or part of the canon of science fiction. People like more people like Asimov than Bradbury, but they tried to depict worlds that are possible, that are consistent with the laws of our universe, that are in some cases ideal, in some cases less than ideal, but that are always somehow rooted in our reality. And scientists, of course, study the nature of our reality. So there are some obvious correlations between science fiction and the practices of science that can inform each other. Science fiction writers who ignore the science are at risk of presenting themselves as fantasy writers instead of science fiction writers, which is fine if you want to be a fantasy writer. I also love Tolkien and all those sorts of books as well. But that's a distinct genre, and I do think that there is a sort of duty on the part of science fiction writers to be informed about the current state of science, and I think engage in some congress with scientists. One of my models for such a writer is David Brin, who is constantly updating his knowledge about science, and is a big science advocate, and also has informed some of the discussions in science with some of his books about the climate and climate change. So I think there's an interesting interplay between these communities. I think there's a way it can be done best, and that is that each informs the work of the other. And that, when science fiction writers don't want to be bound by science, that they acknowledge that they're taking some sort of conscious divergence from the known into some different realm.
That's really interesting. I think especially when you think about all the science fiction set in space, which, tends to kind of elide the question of how this travel is all happening at faster than light speeds, or sometimes there's hard science attempts to engage with that, but that's definitely like an interesting question about the differentiation between science fiction and mere speculative fiction. I guess Dr.
If I could say that's a really excellent example, because the Star Trek warp speed was conceived of as a way to deal with this, the problem of getting the Enterprise from star to star, but wasn't totally unhinged from science, and in fact is related to innovations that are occurring in space, at least theoretical innovations like the Alcubierre drive. That was a Mexican researcher who realized, that warping space helps to get around the faster than light speed issue. So yeah, science fiction actually not only got some ideas from science there, but has inspired a bunch of scientists to pursue this as an actual field of study.
Yeah, I sort of see it as in the science fiction writers are sort of taking some liberties with what's already there. It's kind of like what they tell you in improv is the yes and, right? You have a little bit of knowledge about the science, right? Whether it's extensive or not, it doesn't really matter. And then they sort of flex their creativity to just add something new or something extra to it. And I think the example of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, for example, that's one of the big sort of, that's kind of how I open the class that I'm teaching about science fiction and the brain, is sort of going through kind of a chronological order of science fiction. And Mary Shelley kicked off a lot of it. And she specifically does a real subtle name check of Galvani, who was the guy who put the correlation between bioelectricity, right? You can run electrical current through a dissected frog leg, and you can make that leg move in response to it. And then I think in my imagination, what Shelley was doing at the time when she was on vacation, like most productive vacation you could ever possibly have, when she came back from the vacation with the manuscript for Frankenstein, was she was imagining sort of, yes, what if you could do a little spark of energy, but instead of just a little spark, what if you made it big enough or pronounced enough to energize an entire creature, for example, right? And then what would be I guess the really cool creative part is, what are the implications beyond the science, right? The science is just a little spark, but the major ideas behind her writing, the way I see it, is really about how does society respond, or what might happen in best or worst case scenarios.
So we're hearing a lot about how science kind of informs science fiction. And I'm curious if either of you could kind of speak more to how science fiction does inform science, or could inform science, or should inform science. I know, David, you mentioned a little bit about Star Trek inspiring some physics research, which is not an area I'm very familiar with. And I do know there's, a lot of talk about how so much technology that we have today looks like Star Trek because the people who created it grew up watching Star Trek. And so that would be, I guess, an obvious example. But I know both of you have thought a lot about the social and policy ideas that intersect with science, and if you could speak to how science fiction comes into that, or if it does, that would be great.
Well, I think it always has. So the ideas behind Shelley's Frankenstein were about the nature of the soul and what it is to be a person having rights, and also the nature of being free from a creator. So these were big philosophical issues she's grappling with in the book, not simply, I mean, the science is sort of involved, but not really the center of that discussion. And ever since, writers like Verne and H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells had a lot to say about society and used science fiction to say those things. He had a very specific political ideology he was promoting, and he did so through the use of speculative fiction about the future. The time machine is not about the machine; it's about what happens to society, and the problems that evolved from where we are now. That was his exact point about the stratification of society, and how it would end up. Science fiction is really, I think, at its best when it's used as a tool to explore what our duties are in general, but also science fiction helps to bring to light certain very specific ethical conundrums that relate to technologies and science. I'm thinking of the Andromeda strain and that sort of concern about space. That was about a space virus, I think it was, coming back to Earth and threatening us because of space exploration. So these are actual things that scientists have to consider when we're exploring space and other worlds, and I'm sure that scientists would have thought of it on their own, but it's good to have speculative fiction writers who can come up with the worst case and weirdest case scenarios to get scientists thinking creatively about potential issues that actually might arise.
I think as far as some more concrete answers, I don't know. I can't think of any specific examples where, for example, a researcher will come up with some new technology and say, oh, I was inspired directly by this thing. I feel like it'd be nice if that did pop up in interviews a little bit more frequently. But I think that some of the new technologies, it's kind of interesting that you can almost imagine that they are maybe not consciously inspired by something in science fiction or something that's been written about before. I think so. One of the really interesting technologies that I think is fun and maybe was inspired by science fiction, and I don't know if this is true, this is me speculating about speculative science, but in comic books, right, we think about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and you have Ant-Man, right? And there's this magical thing called a Pym particle, all in the lore, all in the canon of the comic books that goes back several decades. And in theory, you can use this particle to make yourself bigger or smaller, right? Science fiction-ish, right? Recently, within the past 15 years or so, maybe 20 years by now, there's a really creative group of researchers who came up with a really neat microscopy technique, a really powerful way to image the stuff that's too small for us to see with light, right? So when we think about neuroscience, I think the synapse is one of the most interesting structures. And it's a little gap between two cells, and it's about 10 to 40 nanometers across, right? So when we think about what nanometers looks like, it's like 1,000 times smaller than a micrometer, so 1,000 times smaller than a millimeter. It's a distance that's so small that you physically can't even use light waves to look at it, right? Light waves have 200 to 800 nanometer distances, so a light wave will just bounce over a synapse, so you can't physically see it. Okay, to tie this all back to the Pym particles from Ant-Man and Stan Lee, these researchers developed a way to, instead of try to look at smaller things, they found a way to just make small things bigger. And I don't know how you could possibly come up with this idea. It just sounds like I've run out of ways to look at really small things, which they do have ways to do that, but they're just very expensive, right? So they developed this technique called expansion microscopy, where instead of trying to look at stuff smaller than the wavelength of light, why don't we just make the stuff bigger so it's easier to see? And to me, it's such a simple idea that, if you ask a 3-year-old a question like, how do I see something really small? They're just going to say, just make it bigger, right? I don't know if maybe they saw Honey, I Blew Up the Kids from the 90s. There was also a movie about making small stuff big, but these researchers came up with this to me, it's like, I don't know how you'd come to something like that if you weren't inspired by a what if kind of question. Maybe it came from science fiction, maybe it didn't.
So,
it probably came from diapers, actually, because diapers are made up of molecules that also expand in size in a similar way. So I don't know.
I think that speaks to the nature of inspiration and how diffuse it is. And I guess it, can be kind of a trick question to ask what inspires what. But another thing that I was just thinking of as you were both talking was how you both mentioned, with Shelley, with Wells, how science fiction has historically really raised a lot of important social issues. And sometimes, that's in very metaphorical ways. Like if we think about Butler or Bradbury, right? Where like what they're talking about are social trends, not the specifics of how might this specific development affect us. But if you think about, some contemporary science fiction writers and even past ones, but one example that's coming to my mind is Annalee Newitz. I don't know if anyone is familiar with your work, but I highly recommend their novel Autonomous, which explores a whole bunch of potential implications of developing artificially intelligent machines and also the expansion of pharmaceutical companies, all of which are trends that exist in our world, and they just kind of take them and say, okay, what would this look like, if it continued forward at this pace? How would society have to adapt to it, and what might a poor adaptation look like? And obviously we've all experienced, it's cliche to say it by now, but unprecedented scientific chain of events, right, in the global pandemic. And there definitely have been science fiction portrayals of pandemics that were dealt with mostly poorly, and we can talk about how those relate to the actual events that occurred in various world governments. Which is all to say, I'm curious if either of you have, and there's no right or wrong answer to this, and it's also kind of on the spot, but examples of science fiction that you think brought up issues that could have been heated and should have been heated, or that were heated and led to productive developments in terms of specifically these questions of how technologies might affect societies and how societies should respond to that.
So yeah, that is a tough one. Two works that come to mind. One is a sort of speculative alternative timeline fiction, which I'm going to include in this for the sake of argument. The Difference Engine by William Gibson and Bruce Sterling is set in the Victorian era, where Babbage's difference engine becomes, an actual computer at some point, and computation arrives about 100 years earlier. So there's a couple of things that I think that are useful about that that book. The other one I'll get to in a second is also a sort of Victorian thing in the future, and that is Neil Stephenson's The Diamond Age. So I want to talk about those two works because each of them is about social stratification, about the way that monopolization of technology enables the control of society by an elite few. And that seems to me highly relevant to the way that the computer age that we're living in has developed, the monopolization of the tools and the channels that are enabled by those tools is, I think, exactly what each of those works is referencing and warning about. And that this was, I think each was about 20 years ago. These works came out at the sort of dawning of our own computer era. But we didn't take heed. And now we see in the way that computers and the internet and communication are monopolized, a realization of the sort of warnings that they have in them. So The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson has a sort of hopeful ending in which we can undo this by releasing and undoing the monopoly through some marvelous new technology. The difference engine, William Gibson and Bruce Sterling. It's a collaborative work. I like Bruce Sterling too. He has some interesting work. So Bruce Sterling also wrote a book called Heavy Weather about 20 years ago, I think, in which the sort of future of climate change unravels in a starkly foreboding way. And we are seeing those storms that he wrote about in that book now. So these are all, I think, examples of where science fiction writers gave us some means of addressing issues that were coming and that we didn't really take as seriously as perhaps we should have.
Yeah. And that reminds me of another piece of work where there's sort of a warning that was put there that we may not have fully understood yet. It has to do with what I'm imagining. Philip K. Dick, he wrote "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?" Right? I'm pretty sure that's him, right? And okay, yeah, just wanted to make sure I was right there. So this book was the inspiration for Blade Runner, include the original Blade Runner from couple decades back, plus the most recent one that just came out a few years back. In it, the whole idea, the principle behind it is that there are androids who are existing, they're sort of company property, and the objective or the goal of these Blade Runners is to go around places and hunt them down, right? Partially because it's outdated technology and it's company property that has been put into these people's heads. This reminded me, so there was an article that I was sending around to some of us when this event was being organized. And it had to do with deep brain stimulators that are used for people with Parkinson's disease, right? So Parkinson's disease, one of the therapies, it's one of the more extreme therapies, but it seems to have very strong evidence that it's very effective at helping people. You basically just, drill a hole, put a little electrode stimulator into different parts of the basal ganglia in the brain, basically. And whenever you stimulate these structures, it helps people move better. It helps eliminate tremors and just basically restores people back to normal movement. The problem was a lot of this technology is still, it's not experimental because it is an approved therapy, but it's still in a field that is not fully fleshed out. So there's a lot of companies that are trying to get into the deep brain stimulator industry. They're making devices that are the stimulators. They're making devices that are little battery packs, everything that comes along with deep brain stimulators. The issue is that some of these companies haven't had a chance to really follow up with the patients after the stimulators have been implanted. And so there's all sorts of reasons why these companies do this. Maybe they find that it's not profitable. Maybe they have pivoted to a different industry. Regardless, they're not continuing to do updates, and they're not following up with the patients who are walking around with these deep brain stimulators permanently implanted in their heads. I have a really old Chromebook. It doesn't get software updates anymore, right? This is what I use because nobody's going to steal it. And it's just what I have, right? It doesn't get software updates. It's probably got some safety related security, cybersecurity related issues. But I guess this is all, it sort of made me think about the parallels between the two, right? What is the possibility? Now, obviously, people aren't going to be hunted down for tiny little pieces of metal in their brain, like Philip K. Dick had imagined, but there's still essentially abandoned pieces of technology that are out there in people's brains. And I don't exactly know what's going to happen from there. From what I understood, it's on the order of maybe hundreds of people who just have the outdated deep brain stimulators, and one day the battery packs aren't going to be manufactured and something's going to break down. I've always just been curious about what's going to happen with all of those people. And maybe David has some insights about the legal philosophical side of things, since I'm so buried in neurons and action potentials that I forget about society a lot of times. I don't know if you have any insights or thoughts about that whole situation.
About DBS, so yeah, that is an interesting issue. The intellectual property issues related to the devices are certainly, potentially concerning for people with those devices, because you can't hack things that are not your intellectual property under a lot of licenses. So that might be an issue depending upon the license. If I were getting an implant, I would certainly want to be sure that I own the right to modify that implant at some point, because it's going to be part of my body. So these are all excellent questions that I'm sure, that Philip K. Dick certainly presaged in some ways in that great story. I'd also like to mention that Philip K. Dick has inspired some of the best film science fiction, considering issues of what it means to be a person and things like that. So Total Recall and any number of Philip K. Dick adaptations. Unfortunately, Philip K. Dick is sort of like the Vincent van Gogh of sci-fi. He wasn't as famous while he was alive as he is afterward, but he had, he was a philosopher doing sci-fi.
I think that kind of talks to, I guess, what is like a major theme in the work of so many science fiction writers and directors, which is how we develop society along certain models, right? Such as, our capitalist society where ownership and intellectual property works in a certain way. And then developments occur that model can't really keep up with, which I think is something you, David, dealt with in the Who Owns You, right, in terms of the intellectual property as relates to genomes. But there are all sorts of things that this kind of precipitates, and we saw this also during the pandemic in terms of the rights to pharmaceutical patents and what happens when that runs up against the needs of global society. So that's something I definitely would like to hear more about, but just before we forget, there is a question in the chat from Juliana. Juliana, would you like to unmute and ask, or we can just read it?
Yeah, I saw that. So definitely, Juliana, thank you for that question. As I said, I was exposed at a very young age to H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and others, and I think those writers had very specific political leanings, and that probably had something to do with first of all, my parents, who influenced me to read those works, but also I think even now, I mentioned Neil Stevenson, his work on um, uh, things like intellectual property has influenced the way I think about it. So he's very much a proponent of open culture, and yeah, I think that his stories make his points about it very effectively, and I use those stories as starting points for a lot of my own philosophical work on it, as both in pedagogy and in my own opinions.
So, sorry, just in case anyone didn't see the chat, Juliana asked, do you think about the political aspects or the social criticism that science fiction authors propose in their work has influenced your work? And Austin, I wanted to ask that question not only in relation to your research, but I know you do nonfiction science writing as well. And I know that fiction has certainly influenced David's writing with the Breaking Bad philosophy book. But I was curious if science fiction has influenced your science writing at all.
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you. As far as, so from the perspective of my academic research, it's very granular, cellular, circuitry level stuff, and I don't really have a chance to incorporate a lot of the sort of political aspects or social criticism that the science fiction has led to. But outside of that, I do have some, I guess, mini little projects in the work, and I am very interested in looking at the tie-in between science fiction and some other scientific applications. So, for instance, a lot of the stuff with the deep brain stimulators, which may or may not have been stimulated, or may have not been sort of inspired by some of that work. I think it's, for me, the fun part is kind of looking back at old science fiction and trying to see the threads that tie that in with other pieces of technology that may have popped up since then. So one little project that I've been working about thinking through is some the science fiction works of H.P. Lovecraft, who has, it's a little bit of this psychological horror kind of stuff. And anytime we start thinking about horror, it's pretty easy to get into looking through the psychology of people's minds and how they think about fear and how they think about vast emptinesses of space and humanity's place in everything, right? And I think that's kind of the only like real threads that I imagine myself having from a writing level with science fiction.
So thank you. Before we continue with some other questions that Jackson and I are very curious about, I just wanted to pause again and ask if anybody in the physical audience or on Zoom has a question, comment, something you'd like to raise. Anyone? I mean, we have plenty of questions, so we can continue. And if somebody has something that you want to bring up afterwards, there's more time. One question that we have kind of noted down, I think, has really been answered in interesting ways by both of you, which was whether science fiction is a form of science communication, and if so, in what way. And I think we definitely have heard that, both as David mentioned, that in hard science fiction is a way to really ingest some actual scientific concepts in a more readable and sometimes more exciting way than it would be to sit down and read a paper. And I think definitely Austin has also talked about how science fiction can tell us both about science that's happening and how we might react to it. So I think that one we've kind of gotten to, but I have another, oh, yes.
Just to kind of add on to that question, I think so I love the idea for science fiction to be a way to teach science fact. I think that there are engaging writers who are out there who can tell these really interesting stories. And I'd love for those stories to be the hook that gets people into science. I've always had this like weird fantasy that I would love for the makers of the Shadowrun tabletop role-playing game franchise to contact me and tell me, hey, please write a neuroscience textbook, but you can use all of our intellectual property. I really want to make that happen. I would love to have a scene where somebody is being told, instead of your typical kind of science fiction interrogation scene, they're being explained that these are receptors and these are the properties of the synapse, and this is how neuroscience works. I'd love to write that book. So if anyone could make my science fiction fantasies become true, I think that'd be great. But one of the challenges that I've always think about if we could find great ways to, tie in science fiction and science fact, is how difficult it is, at least for me, to make obvious the distinction between what is the stretch versus what is the current state of the world, right? So, for instance, to go back to Mary Shelley, right? At the time, they had some premise that, you could run electrical current through, let's see, I think that was a little bit later. You could run electrical current through a dissected frog leg, get it to twitch a little bit, right? But then at what point how can you explain that as being, yes, this is something that somebody did in a laboratory, and then say, oh yes, but then the creature completely coming to life and doing all the terrible things that it does, but also the lovable things that it does at the same time. How can you explain that, which is the actual fact and which is the kind of what if? And that's been a real, at least when I'm thinking about making my class or designing my class and teaching both science fiction and science fact, I found that I'm going to have a really hard time. I know I'm going to have a hard time saying that this is the state of the knowledge. We know about this technology and this is real. People still use this technology today, but this author took a few creative liberties here and said, these are the things that you can do with this technology. And I'm gonna have a challenging time trying to make which is clear for my students. And so it'd be nice to make that obvious. And I don't know how to do that.
Is definitely something to think about. And as you're talking, I was even thinking about just how, as much as we know, obviously there's a lot we don't know. And this is going to sound like really funny that this is the thing I'm picking on of all the unrealistic things in all of science fiction history, but the Vulcans have always really bugged me, because clearly whoever created the Vulcans didn't understand anything about the mammalian motivation system. Like, emotions are not some separable component of the system that is the individual. If you didn't have emotions, you also would not get out of bed in the morning, because there would be no force that is responsible for giving you the idea that you should do things. So there's always going to be this moment, right, of when we write science fiction, it's based on the science as far as it's gotten up to now. And in the future, we'll see all the pieces that we're not quite there yet, right? So I think that's also especially interesting when we consider older science fiction, to think about where people thought the developments were moving, and then it was actually like a totally different direction that all of these things went in. And I guess that does raise a question to me also, just on the spot, out of curiosity, if either of you have an example where you think is interesting to look back on, like that the science fiction writer clearly thought things were moving in a certain direction, but ended up being totally non-predictive.
So, so lamentably, Isaac Asimov's works they're scientifically very good, in the sense that all of the things he writes about are in some way conceivable, based upon his knowledge at the time. But specifically the space stuff. So the 2001 which was turned into just one of my all-time favorite movies of 2001: A Space Odyssey, was spot on in terms of, orbital mechanics and, exploring space and what might be done based upon the space race as it was going on at the time. But lamentably, it didn't occur. So yeah, the fact that we don't have moon bases, and that, despite the Artemis program, we're not likely to anytime in the near future. These were all very, I think, understandably optimistic views of our presence in space, but also somewhat naive, given the nature of the corporate interests involved in getting into space and settling space. So I think that that's the one that comes to mind the most, because I would have loved to have us have moon bases and whatnot, and beautiful orbital platforms and things like that.
And they're always so shiny in those movies. And I always imagine space is I don't know. I know there's not a lot of stuff there, but I'd imagine if you had any gravity at all, you'd collect a lot of dust very quickly. So the story that I wanted to tell related to the prompt is, I know I might be dodging your question just a tiny bit, but it's one of my all-time favorite stories about a discovery that was made. So to give you some background information about the science fiction that was related to this technology, this is from an H.P. Lovecraft story. So it's written in the early 1900s, around probably 1910 or something like that. So the story, it's called Beyond the Wall of Sleep. And the idea behind it is that there is a scientist, who comes up with a way to read brain activity. Right? He puts this little hat on people, and you're able to read what's going on in a person's brain. And in the story, the fictional component was that he was able to read that there's this person who is actually a guy from outer space, and he seems like his body dies on Earth, but he's actually going up. He's a celestial being that's battling a demon star, and he dies, right? So that's sort of typical Lovecraft, where it goes way off the rails at the very end. The interesting thing was that this is based on another piece of real technology that was being developed at the time, which is still used today, the electroencephalogram, or the EEG. Right. So it's this cap that people get this all the time for studying if they have epileptic seizures, for sleep-related issues. So you can put on one of these caps. They're relatively cheap, and it's basically just reading brain activity. And this was considered to be a huge, a great advancement at the time. The really interesting thing, the story part, which I think is fun, is the history of how the EEG was developed. It was developed by this German researcher named Hans Berger. And the story behind it goes, he was riding on a horse, right? Part of his military training after, I think he dropped out of college, but he was riding on a horse doing some kind of military drill. And the horse was suddenly surprised by something. He bucked, and Berger fell off the horse. And at that very moment, there was a really large artillery cannon that was moving towards him, and it would have crushed him if he hadn't sort of screamed out at the very moment, very last second, saying, "Hey, I'm under here. Like, please don't smush my head." Then, like the next day or 2 days later, his sister, who was several hundreds of miles away, randomly sent him a telegram saying, "Hey, how are you doing? Are you doing well? I just thought about you." And he put these two pieces together, which were entirely coincidental. And he said, "Wow, this is clearly telepathy. I'm able to communicate with my sister, who's hundreds of miles away, in the moment right before I died. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to come up with a way to read these telepathic waves. And all I have to do is just put stuff on my head and produce these telepathic waves." And he created the EEG out of, complete pseudoscience. And this is EEGs that we use every day today in laboratories, hundreds and thousands of EEG systems being used every single day based on, this false promise. I think it's a very interesting story. And yeah, I missed your question, but I just wanted to tell that story. So thanks for giving me the chance.
No, I think that's so.
Can I riff on that for a second to recognize two stories that are probably better than the Lovecraft story? So, I love Lovecraft, but I mean, it's pulp fiction, and we have to ignore his predilections. But the 19, I think it was late 70s movie Brainstorm, I think 1980. Brainstorm has a similar notion, right? These scientists trying to create a helmet there you can read people's minds, with Natalie Wood's last performance, by the way. And it's an interesting film, and it raises interesting questions. And in that film, the people use this, of course, as they do in the typical late 70s movie paranoia fashion, to commit espionage and things like that. And then the mid 80s film, Until the End of the World by Wim Wenders, which is a 5-hour film, and I don't recommend you watch the 5-hour version, but I have, so you don't have to. It's a great film, and if you're into 5-hour films, you should watch it. But there's a 2-hour version that was the theatrical release. In that, William Hurt plays a scientist who's trying to create a way to allow his mother, who's blind, to see. And it turns out that this device can also be used to see people's dreams if they fall asleep wearing the device. And then these people become addicted to their dreams. It's a fascinating story. So these are better takes on the H.P. Lovecraft idea that raise another host of interesting philosophical questions about, the privacy of our thoughts, etc.
So I'm not going to ask you to name science fiction writers who you think are predicting the future correctly, because this is going to be recorded and I don't need to post your wrong answers for blackmail for all time. But almost as bad, I will put both of you on the spot and ask, we've talked about a lot of classic science fiction and what I would consider the new classics. William Gibson, Neil Stephenson, who arguably were, the few science fiction writers who were on the right track by realizing that the information revolution was going to be the next big sweeping change. I'm curious if either of you have read any new science fiction lately that you would recommend to our audience. Or watch, that's fine too. Movies are fine too.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of tell if you compare my background versus David's beautiful library that I'm very jealous of. My reading has not been too prolific as of late. But one thing that I think is kind of an interesting take on what might be happening in the near future. It's not exactly a book, but I did mention it briefly before, the tabletop role-playing game Shadowrun. There's a lot of really interesting ideas there. There's a lot of like sort of fun fantasy elements like elves and fireballs and stuff like that. But they also have a very dark view of what our future is going to look like. So the role-playing game came out probably in the 80s or something. It was a little after the D&D craze. So it was one of the other I guess franchises that are out there at the time. But one of the big elements that we see, so the Shadowrun universe is huge. There's a bunch of books that are written several times every year. It's published by a game company that also makes like baseball cards, super random stuff. But they also write a lot of, they write their fiction by putting it in the context of the role-playing game, which I think is pretty neat. It's a very creative way to sort of come up with new stories, and an interesting way to present them. They have this view of extremely pessimistic view of the world in the future. So it takes place in 2080, where basically everything is run by mega corporations. They have more power than countries, and these corporations are controlling every aspect of people's lives. And you work for them for your life, and the people who aren't working for them are the criminals, and they're the interesting characters that you play as a lot of times. I think it's dark because it draws from some little tiny bits of of almost like reality, right? You just take it a little farther. You're like, what if all of the So the example that David mentioned earlier about internet companies consolidating a lot of stuff. What if companies do that, but instead of just consolidating internet and speech, they consolidate gasoline and food and access to energy and all that stuff. And it has this really strong political underlying theme that I think it's dark. And yeah, I don't know. It's dark. There's also, I mean, it's kind of the epitome of what you think about with the cyberpunk universe, right? We think about a future that is full of all kinds of wonderful technology that helps people remember things better, that helps people run faster and jump higher and do all the great things that robots and androids would be able to help us with, but it still doesn't improve. It doesn't improve what humanity is going to do kind of at its worst. And I don't know, maybe I'm just very pessimistic about the future, but it's a dark future and it's interesting. It's got some really fun storytelling elements.
So if I may, so I think my favorite recent sort of speculative fiction that I use a fair amount also in teaching was the Mad Adam books by Margaret Atwood, because that deals with a lot of interesting stuff having to do with altering genomes, and that's a topic that I like to wrestle with, and you know, the social and environmental consequences of that, as well as the political debates about it. But you know, my current major interests are in the James Corey's the adaptation of his novels into and now the series name escapes me, even though it's fantastic. Somebody tell me quickly. It was on Amazon Prime. No, this is my early dementia. I don't recommend losing your memory. Somebody tell me James Corey's, it was a great series.
Expanse?
The Expanse, thank you. Yes, because it wasn't the same as the books. So yeah, the Expanse series, thank you so much, is a fantastic series. I think a real masterpiece of science fiction storytelling, both epic and engaging, but also grounded in some hard science. So I love that series because it deals with interplanetary travel in a way that is believable. But it also raises a lot of interesting questions about potential, you know, contact with, you know, some alien species or artifact. So that's my current sort of guilty pleasure, is The Expanse, which I could watch that series again and again. And I think that, you know, actually we're in a sort of a renaissance in television, where because of the availability of channels and a fair amount of money, good storytelling like Breaking Bad and The Expanse and others is you know, cinematically done on television, and so I recommend that one to everyone. But also, I think Margaret Atwood's works have always been great for raising really important, pressing social issues in the you know, in the guise of sci-fi, but also dealing with, you know, again, real potential human issues.
Thank you. I'd like to open up to the audience if any of you have any recommendations, anything you'd like to share that the rest of us should be reading, watching. And so we don't put you totally on the spot, I'll share the most recent sci-fi novel that I read. Well, most recent one, which was Neom, and that's part of Lavie Tidhar's Central Station series, which is a fascinating series set in the far future universe. There's almost no element of realism to it, but what I find very interesting is how Tidhar engages social trends in like very believable but wildly fantastic ways. And specifically, one of the major themes in this particular book is that the plot revolves around this trend or phenomenon, which is like a historic trend in the universe of the book, of the terror artists, which were a movement of, nihilistic terrorists whose acts of terror were not motivated by any political ideology, but rather were purely artistic spectacle that happened to kill thousands of people. And obviously, I don't have to go into a whole thesis about social media and spectacle and etc. All of the themes that is tapping into in a way that is both like horrible and absurd, but also speaks to a lot of things that I think feel very familiar.
Just another, since we're thinking about stuff outside books, and I'm a little bit more aware of some of those things. One thing that was kind of neat, and I never actually had a chance to watch it, but there's a series, I think it's called Upload. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's about where people can upload their consciousness to some sort of drive thing. So after they die, they can still have some kind of avatar that interacts with the rest of the world. And I thought that was a pretty interesting idea, especially since, concepts about the afterlife that's an ancient topic in science fiction. If you think about whatever you classify as science fiction, the farther back you go, there's always discussion about what's going on in the afterlife. And I think that's a more recent take on what the afterlife could be. Maybe I'm wrong about the name, but I think it is on, it's one of those streaming networks. I don't know if anyone else has seen it.
Altered Carbon is also another one in which, that raises interesting things about the nature of consciousness versus the body. So the body is just this, what they call a sleeve in that series. And your consciousness can move between your bodies, and it raises, these all give us opportunities to talk about relevant issues today about our bodies and ourselves.
So I think we're going to start wrapping up. Again, if any audience members have questions, this is your chance. In the meantime, I'm going to put Jackson on the spot and ask you to share a science fiction recommendation with everybody.
Yeah, so I guess thinking of in the vein of scientific communication and such, I think something that has stuck with me for a while now is one of my neuroscience professors in college. He knew someone that was writing a book on all of these different zombie movies and zombie invasion movies, but he took it from kind of a neuroscientific grasp, and we were actually able to dissect all of these different movies and about zombies and such, and kind of learn from them in a way that was kind of grasping onto the scientific fiction that they wrote about, but then kind of delving into a more medical stance, and the different diseases that maybe these zombies had, or what was the cause in, or what really was driving them to act in certain ways and stuff. And that book was super cool, because we got to see it as it was being developed, and then also just go through it all. So I think that was a really interesting take on how we were kind of looking at kind of like this feedback loop between science fiction, and then also like science actually informing fiction, and then fiction also we're able to work with that and kind of pull what we want from that and just delve into that in terms of learning and such. That was really interesting. I can't remember the name, but I'll post it or something. Yeah. Also, I think Interstellar, like we were talking earlier about like a way, this is also just, I've been thinking about scientific communication because it's such a fascinating topic. I think Kip Thorne and like how they really included him, or I'm not exactly sure how much he was included, but it seems from all the Nobel Prize laureate posts, it seems like he was pretty included in some of that. I think that's just a really interesting way of having people learn about science in a different fashion. And I think that really excites people and hones people into this fictional world that may be driven by a lot of the science and such. So
that's an excellent example. So one of the great science communicators of our time, Carl Sagan, also wrote fiction, a book called Contact, which was turned into an interesting movie. I think, again, was a way for him to try to convey some ideas that he'd been working on at JPL in terms of how we reach out to the stars, to potential inhabitants of other planets, not just through the spaceships we sent that he helped with, but also in other potential ways. So that example also comes to mind.
Thank you. I think we have lots of other questions and such on this topic, but we're going to wrap up, and Jackson and I will try to compile most of these recommendations to send everybody on our Project Bridge mailing list. If anybody thinks of any last minute follow-up questions, as I mentioned at the beginning, Dr. Koepsell, Dr. Lim are both on Twitter and also easily Googleable. So with that, I'm going to say thanks to both of you so much for your time and lots of interesting contributions on this topic. And thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.